So Amicus Productions was going strong with making horror anthology films or portmanteau films in the early 70s. In 1972, they released two films, Tales from the Crypt and Asylum. I've got reviews for both of those on the channel. Then in 1973, they followed it up with The Vault of Horror, which we're going to talk about today. A movie that it seems like a lot of Amicus fans absolutely love. So I might have some hot takes for you. Let's talk about it. Welcome back to the Cobweb channel, everyone. My name is Daniel, and welcome back to my Amicus review series, talking about all of their horror anthologies. This is actually the 6th one. Did you think we were going to make it that far? Well, we did. And The Vault of Horror is directed once again by Roy Ward Baker, who directed the last film in the series, Asylum, but also for Hammer Productions, he directed a lot of movies that I really love, like Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde, Quatermass and the Pit, The Vampire Lovers, tons of just fantastic movies. And the movie was written by Milton Shabotsky, who was one of the co-founders of Amicus, one of the producers of the film. And the movie opens up with some awesome music, very bombastic, dramatic horror music. And it's set to a bunch of guys very calmly, quietly getting into an elevator. The music may be great, but I just do not think the music and the visuals match here. It's a little bit dramatic for what we're looking at, but they get to the bottom of the elevator and they end up in what basically seems to be a small dining room. Now, if we have looked at the title of the movie, we know this is The Vault of Horror. Now, the movie is actually based on EC Comics, and in the EC Comics Vault of Horror series, there is the Vault Keeper. There's no Vault Keeper in this movie. In fact, the movie's status as a Vault of Horror movie is, well, not very accurate. Actually, none of these stories are based on stories you're going to see in the Vault of Horror comic books. They're actually all based on Tales from the Crypt comics, except for one story that is based on shock suspense stories. So the guys all go into this dining room and sit down, and they don't really seem to know why they're there. And one of them brings up having a scary dream. And we figure out that the wraparound for this movie is just going to be these guys telling each other their dreams. And within 5 minutes, we jump into the first segment.
Mysterious, unworldly, almost unbelievable.
This is called Midnight Mess, and it's starring Daniel Massey as a guy who just hired a private detective to try to find his sister. And when the private detective is able to deliver that information to him, our main character strangles him to death. So this movie is not messing around. We're jumping into murder right away. And much like the Tales from the Crypt movie just had horrible protagonists, people doing evil things as the star in every segment, this movie is very much going to pick up that mantle and just have a bunch of terrible guys. So he goes to look for his sister, but we have a feeling it's for some kind of a sinister reason. Probably because he just murdered a guy. But when he gets there, the first thing he does is to go get some food, because why go confront your sister on an empty stomach? But when he goes into the restaurant, they tell him to leave. They're closing. They always close before dark because that's when they come out. So now we're wondering, who are they? Well, he leaves, goes to meet up with his sister, and says, hey, Dad is dead. He left you everything in his inheritance unless you die. Then he murders his sister. So we've got our second murder in this movie. By the way, his sister is played by Anna Massey. Anna Massey? Anna Massey. That almost sounds like one word. The actor's real life sister. So they're real life siblings playing siblings here that you know, murder each other. So that's fun. So now that his sister's been murdered, he's really in the need of some food, and he notices that restaurant is back open. So he goes in, sits down, orders the special, and one by one realizes that each of the courses in this meal are just blood. Yes, this is a vampire segment, but it's also a vampire town segment, doing that before the 80s, when A Return to Salem's Lot and Sundown, The Vampire in Retreat, would both use the concept of a vampire town. And here's where the segment gets goofy and kind of comedic, which makes sense since Milton Shabotsky wrote this thing, because famously he did not like vampire movies. He said he could not take them seriously. So pretty much whenever you see vampires in any of these Amicus movies, it's going to be goofy, it's going to be comedic. This movie follows that. And when the vampires get their teeth out, they look so stupid. I'm just going to say it. They look so ridiculous with these little fangs just kind of poking out. Just unbelievably fake. But I gotta say, the movie does end with a pretty fantastic image of a beer spout stuck into his neck, and they're just coming up with their cups and just getting that blood right on out. Then we come back to our wraparound after he's told everyone his dream. By the way, if I had a dream where I murdered 2 people, including my sister, I don't know that I would tell a room full of strangers that. It's not a good look. But wouldn't you know it, another guy at the table wants to tell the story of his dream. This guy is played by Terry Thomas, and the segment is called The Neat Job. So, Terry Thomas stars as this businessman who has been single all his life, just focused on work, and informs a friend of his that he's finally getting married. He says that the woman that he's marrying is actually the daughter of a friend, which sounds weird, sounds like she's gonna be like really young, but when we meet her, she's not. Definitely a little younger than him, but nothing crazy. And she's played by Glynis Johns, who a lot of people are going to know as the mom from Mary Poppins. I definitely know her as that from my childhood, but even more importantly from my childhood, I know her as the grandma in While You Were Sleeping. Honestly, one of my favorite movies, so it's really cool to see her in this. Our main character describes himself as very easy to get along with, but we quickly discover that is definitely not the case. Now look, he's a bit of a neat freak, quite a bit, but he's also someone who's been living alone for practically his whole life, so he's set in his ways, right? He has everything where he wants it, he doesn't want anything messed with, and I feel like he really didn't think it through before he got married, that he might actually have to compromise. He's not accepting of that, and he just turns out to be an absolute jerk.
Tomato puree, no tomato puree. 3 marks, spaghetti sauce. No spaghetti sauce.
He's just an obnoxious, annoying jerk and a bad husband who yells at Glynis Johns. And like, that's the mom in Mary Poppins. You leave her alone. Of all these segments, I think this one has the best human story. I feel the most invested in their story, the most sympathetic with Glynis Johns, because she also definitely did not marry this guy for love. There's a scene where she's talking to her friend about her and her dad don't have any money and she doesn't have any professional skills. So she's like, what am I supposed to do? I'm just going to marry this guy. Very sad, just an economic marriage. But she very much goes insane very quickly. You see, there is a fantastic, hilarious scene where she is trying to do some work around the house, but keeps messing little things up. And it just keeps building and building in this long scene where the mess ups get more and more dramatic. And eventually she's practically destroyed the house as she's been so nervous. It's really hilarious. And then he comes home, yells at her, and she murders him. And we get a pretty great shot of a hammer in his head, which is really fun. And then she fully loses her mind when she realizes she does want to be a neat freak. She does want everything in its place, but it's all the guy's organs in jars, which is a great stinger to end on. This segment's so much fun. Let's roll right into segment number 3 called This Trick'll Kill You. And this is supposedly the dream of a man played by Kurt Jurgens. He's probably the most famous for people today for being the villain in the best Roger Moore James Bond movie, The Spy Who Loved Me. And he is a magician who's on the hunt in India for a new trick, for some new material. He's traveling with his wife, played by Dawn Adams, who Hammer fans probably know as Dr. Jekyll's wife in The Two Faces of Dr. Jekyll, which is a great movie. And we open up with him watching the act of a local street magician, and there he does something just unbelievably unprofessional and goes up and discredits this guy, shows the audience how he did it for like no reason other than to just be mean. And like, you're a magician. You should know how incredibly not cool that is. Like, do not do that to another magician. That's so mean. But he's almost given up hope on finding a new trick. But on the streets at night, he does find a woman who is, okay, I'm going to sound really ignorant here, but it is she's playing gosh. She's playing an instrument, and out of the basket comes this rope coming up. You know, it's like a stereotypical thing of playing this instrument and a snake comes up. Somebody out there knows all the proper terms. I'm sorry for being so ignorant. But the rope comes up and it floats, and she is able to then climb up it, and he cannot figure out how she did this. She claims it's real magic. He's not so sure. But she will not sell him the trick. She will not sell him the rope because it's been in her family for so many generations. And he murders her. People are really quick to murder in this movie. Like, that's definitely what most of these segments are about. Lots and lots of murder. But then he takes the trick, and when he plays this instrument, I was very impressed that he's actually able to play it. Like, oh, okay, good for you. The rope does indeed come up, but of course it comes with a price, and then attacks him. And when the rope is attacking him, It looks pretty silly. Just this little rope floating around. It does look better than the vines attacking in Dr. Terror's House of Horrors. I will give it that. But it's just a rope kind of floating at this guy. Now, the segment does end with a pretty good stinger, a pretty good image of him being hung by this floating rope. But overall, the segment just doesn't have that much going on. I appreciate that it's going for some pretty obvious social commentary about British people, or you could just say Western people, coming into other cultures and stealing it, killing people and taking things away. Like, okay, I get it for sure, but the segment's just not that interesting. And the horror of it, this floating rope, is not that cool. Segment number 4 is called Bargain in Death, and it is starring Michael Craig. And right away we realize this is a pretty weird one, because this is the only one that plays kind of non-linear. It opens up with Michael Craig buried alive in a coffin. It cuts to him in the past, talking to his friend, explaining his plan of how he is going to fake his death to collect the insurance money. He is going to appear dead, then actually get buried, and then his friend is going to collect the money and go dig him up. And right away, I gotta say, that is an insane amount of trust that he is putting in his friend. Like, I'm going to give you tons of money and then you're going to share it with me, but you have to literally dig up my grave to do so. And if you just don't do anything, just keep the money, nothing will happen. An enormous amount of trust, and it turns out to be unfounded. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. It then cuts to a couple of his neighbors in his apartment complex, who are a couple of medical students, and they're talking about how much they would love to get another dead body in order to practice dissections on so they can pass their class. So we're getting a sense this is going to be a Burke and Hare, kind of a The Body Snatcher kind of a segment. But cutting back to Michael Craig, he's casually reading the novelization for Tales from the Crypt, which is a pretty cool little meta moment. But he goes through with faking his death. These medical students find him, and they figure out, after this guy gets buried, we should go dig him up. Now, I gotta say, this segment is pretty fun. For one thing, this movie has been very devoid of good atmosphere up to this point, but the graveyard, it's definitely a good look, and this segment just feels spooky in a way that, honestly, none of the previous segments have. And the whole buried alive Edgar Allan Poe kind of a theme is definitely something that appeals to me in horror. Not in real life. Please don't bury me alive. That's the worst thing I can possibly think of. And the segment ends with some great poetic justice. If I compare it to the first segment with the vampires showing up and killing the guy is definitely justice, but is it poetic? It's not exactly satisfying on a story level. The fact that vampires show up is just completely random. For this one, these medical students digging him up and then him jumping out of the grave. And when the medical students run away, it almost feels like something out of the Three Stooges. Like, it's totally inconsistent with the rest of the movie, but it's pretty fun. This segment's a good time. But cutting back to the wraparound, the guy at the table who stands out the most for his bushy hair and long beard is going to tell his dream. And we launch into the 5th segment, which is called Drawn and Quartered, starring Tom Baker, who apparently was known for playing Doctor Who. I'm not a Doctor Who guy, so I wouldn't really know. But when I looked up pictures of him, man, he looks way different as Doctor Who than he looks in this. But he's basically a poor artist, a painter who is living in Haiti, and a friend comes to visit him and informs him that he's actually apparently found some success. Some of his paintings are selling for big money in England. And at that point, he goes to the local voodoo store. He goes in to this guy and says, hey, I want to buy some voodoo. And he says he wants it for revenge. And at this point in the segment, I'm feeling confused because you just found out you found some success in England. Why do you now need revenge against those who wronged you? And I'm intrigued about what's going on here. And the guy says, if you want voodoo, you have to put your hand in boiling water. And he does it. So I'm thinking this guy really wants revenge. He's willing to risk those kind of burns in order to get it. So now I'm very intrigued. The burns don't end up hurting him, but apparently now his hand is infused with magic, with voodoo, and he realizes that anything he draws can now come true. Which honestly, for a painter, sounds like a curse. Like, what if you paint something that you don't want to be real? I think that sounds reasonable. I would love to paint a painting of Dracula, but I would very much prefer for Dracula not to be walking around out there. But he travels back to England to apparently carry out his revenge, and there he meets with an art critic and a couple of art dealers who apparently are cheating him. They purposefully boosted his name, boosted his reputation, so they could sell his paintings for big money and keep all the profits and cut him out. I'm not exactly sure how they're able to do that legally, but I'm sure there's something in the contract that makes that make sense. By the way, the main art dealer there is Denholm Elliott. Yes, Marcus Brody from the Indiana Jones movies, but we haven't seen him in an Amicus movie since The House That Dripped Blood, so it's cool to see him in this. And of course, our main guy paints paintings of all three of these guys and mutilates the paintings in various ways so he can get his revenge, stabbing their eyes out, tearing their hands out, stuff like that. There's actually a kind of fun, gory moment where a guy does get his hands chopped off that's pretty fun, but overall, this segment is just pretty dull. Like, it's just slow moving. There's not that much story. I think Tom Baker gives a really good performance, an intense performance with just such a deep voice. Like, I just think it really works. But even so, the human story here is not that interesting and not one I feel like I care that much about. And the way the story goes is just incredibly obvious. And the poetic justice at the end, his comeuppance, is also very random and just kind of a accidental happenstance, and the segment's just not that great. Let's go and rate this movie. Now for Midnight Mass, I'm going to give it a 6 because it's good. It's solid. I enjoy it. It's fun having a protagonist who's just an absolute psychopath. And when we get to the final reveal, it's fun. It's kind of not well executed and very random, but it's definitely fun. Now the neat job, I'm going to give a 7. This is actually my favorite segment in this movie. And right there, kind of speaks to how I feel about the quality of this film. I do think this movie is a big step down from the last few in this series. So many of these segments just feel good enough, just feel like okay, or at worst, just kind of dull. The movie's mostly devoid of atmosphere, mostly devoid of characters that are interesting or that we enjoy following. But I do really like this one. It's pretty fun. It's got a good stinger at the end, and it's great to see Glynis Johns. So best segment in the movie, but would be a mid-tier, lower-tier segment in a lot of the past anthologies we've been talking about. This Trick Will Kill You, I'm going to give a 4. I was kind of teeter-tottering a 4 or 5, but I'm going to go lower because, like, I just don't find it very interesting. The rope attacking is not a cool image. I understand the kind of social commentary they're going for, but I don't know. Like, it's just kind of lame. Bargain in Death, I'm going to give a 6. This is another one that's just like solid. Pretty good. It's actually probably got the best atmosphere of any of these movies with the graveyard. It's got a pretty compelling story that's unfolded in that non-linear way, which is pretty unique for one of these Amicus movies. And the poetic justice at the end is possibly the most well thought out and well written of all of these segments. But Drawn and Quartered, I'm going to give a 4. It's dull. It's obvious. The human story is just not very interesting. And there's absolutely no cool visuals for you to look at. But the wraparound, I'm going to give the lowest score of any of these. It's going to get a 3. It almost doesn't matter that it's here at all. The fact that this is called the Vault of Horror, and it's just like this kind of small room where they sit around a table and just tell each other their dreams. Honestly, I didn't need this wraparound at all. By the way, did you notice Peter Cushing isn't in this movie? That might contribute to my feelings on it. No Peter Cushing, lower score. Overall, I'm going to give this movie a 5. I just think it's very mid-tier, mediocre. A couple of high points, a couple of pretty low points. Just a mid affair. That's my review, folks, but if you want to keep talking Amicus, check out my Tales from the Crypt review right over here, a movie that I'm much more positive about, and let me know your thoughts on the Vault of Horror down below. I would love to read them, and if you enjoyed this, please give a like and a subscribe for the channel. I would really appreciate it. With all that said, don't forget to enjoy yourself today, have some fun, and I will see you next time.